Hello, my name is Yada,
My name is Jenny.
My name
My
is
name,
Leon.
my name is Melissa.
and today we'll be presenting about Tim O'Brien, the Vietnam War, and his book, The Things They Carried. So the personal life of Tim. Mr. O'Brien was born October 1st of 1946 in Austin, Minnesota, but he grew up mostly in Worthington, which is where he spent a good portion of his childhood. I would say he lived an all-American childhood. For instance, he would, during the summers, participate in a Little League baseball team. And as he got older, though, baseball was replaced with jobs and talking to girls, all that stuff. Um, his father was William Timothy O'Brien, and he was an insurance salesman. And his mother, Ave E. Schultz O'Brien, was an elementary school teacher, and both of them were reading enthusiasts. O'Brien had attended Macalester College, and he earned a bachelor's degree in political science in 1968. While he was in college, he ended up becoming interested in political science. He even participated in peace vigils and protests, specifically war protests, because according to one of the articles I read, he thought we needed people who were progressive and had the patience to try diplomacy instead of dropping bombs on people. So he was essentially against wars. About 2 weeks after graduating from college, O'Brien was drafted into the military in 1968 at only 21 years old. O'Brien was against the war, as I said before, and he believed it was wrong. And from this hatred for war, he constantly debated running away to Canada. But he ultimately decided not to because he realized that fighting in the war was his patriotic duty. So O'Brien answered the call to his draft on August 14th of 1968. He was eventually sent to Fort Lewis in Washington for basic training and was then assigned to a fire base, LZ Gator, in Vietnam. At 22 years old, he served as an infantryman from 1969 to 1970, and he ended up getting wounded twice while serving. As a result of his service and injury, he was awarded the Purple Heart, which was an award for soldiers who were wounded or killed during their service in the military. And after returning to the States from war in 1970, O'Brien decided to continue his graduate studies at Harvard for doctorates. He ended up studying government and political science. And in 1974, before he began his fiction writing, he worked as a national affairs reporter for the Washington Post.
The Vietnam conflict was one of the longest, bloodiest struggles of the Cold War era. How did it start? And how long did it last? What most people call the Vietnam War began in 1946, and at the time was known as the Indochina War. French forces fought against rebelling forces known as the Viet Minh. The two sides fought for nearly 10 years, and the end result was the creation of two nations, North Vietnam and South Vietnam. North Vietnam was led by its founder, Ho Chi Minh, who desired to gain control of the entire former French colony and institute communism nationwide. South Vietnam, under Ngo Dinh Diem, had established a republic. In 1959, North Vietnam, aided by the Soviet Union, attacked South Vietnam. The United States saw this as a Soviet effort to expand communism, and throughout the early 1960s sent soldiers to South Vietnam in the form of advisors to assist the training of South Vietnamese forces. By 1963, 16,000 Americans were stationed in Southeast Asia. In August of 1964, two American ships were reportedly fired upon in the Gulf of Tonkin. This resulted in the U.S. Congress passing the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which gave President Lyndon Johnson authority to conduct military operations in Vietnam in order to protect U.S. personnel. The first American combat troops arrived in Vietnam in 1965. Throughout South Vietnam, North Vietnamese supporters, known as the Viet Cong, fought a guerrilla war against U.S. and South Vietnamese troops. A guerrilla war is one in which hit-and-run tactics are used in order to avoid a direct military confrontation. The North Vietnamese Army also engaged in a more traditional, drawn-out war against American forces. U.S. involvement in Vietnam reached its peak with a Viet Cong attack known as the Tet Offensive. It's known by this name because it occurred during the Vietnamese holiday known as Tet. The Vietnam conflict was widely covered by the American media, and the effectiveness of the well-organized Tet Offensive by enemy forces greatly damaged public support for U.S. involvement in the conflict. Following this incident, the U.S. began the process of Vietnamization. This meant gradually turning the war over to the South Vietnamese as U.S. soldiers were slowly withdrawn. The fighting officially stopped in January of 1973 with the signing of the Paris Peace Accords. Once U.S. forces were completely withdrawn, the North Vietnamese resumed their attacks, and Vietnam was reunited as a communist nation, which it still remains today. Throughout the Vietnam conflict, well over 1 million Vietnamese died, and 58,000 American soldiers also lost their lives.
So that was just some historical background regarding the Vietnam War, which Tim O'Brien did serve for. And so now I'm going to talk about the cultural time period he lived. O'Brien was born during the baby boom era, which was the period after World War II and after the Great Depression. Before the era, couples could not afford marriage or have children. But during the baby boom era, birth rates increased between 1946 and 1964 due to the sense of security and safety that came after surviving the economic struggles and uncertainties from the war and the Great Depression. The baby boomers were considered the first consumer generation because they grew up being exposed to TV and mass media. And since the baby boomers made up about 75 million people, they had a pretty big impact on national culture during the 70s. As they entered their teen years, they spread their music taste, which was like rock and roll, all of that, and they spread their clothing styles and also their haircuts. Being raised with the American dream, they learned to become self-assured and confident, and they strive to push themselves to reach their goals. Because of their powerful influence on society, baby boomers managed to change the country's mindsets of how they viewed those who were powerful. And so I wanted to clarify that the baby boomers express mostly liberal views and attitudes, not all of them, but a lot of them. So in fact, as a result of their political activism, baby boomers gave rise to the Vietnam War's unpopularity and sparked a protest movement against it. By the end of the 1960s, the baby boom generation were becoming adults, and unfortunately, they had to begin preparing for the war that was brewing in Vietnam. A couple connections I made. This is probably the most obvious, but as I've explained in the slides, O'Brien lived and experienced the historical period of the Vietnam War, so it's not too shocking that he wrote about some of his memories, experiences. Another one, The Things They Carried, is his book, which is a collection of 22 linked short stories that focus on O'Brien's recollections of the Vietnam War. One of the connections that I found really interesting was that In one of his short stories on the Rainy River, O'Brien's main protagonist, Tim, had decided he didn't want to go to war, and he attempted to dodge his draft by fleeing to like far in Minnesota and almost Canada. He had spent 6 days at a lodge debating on whether or not he should go to war. He felt pressured to go because he didn't want to embarrass his family or himself. Similarly, being part of the baby boomer generation, O'Brien was one of many who preferred peace over war in real life also. So when he was drafted in real life, he also thought of fleeing to Canada, but he didn't want to attempt this the same way that Tim did in his short story. So in a way, the fictional Tim was like his alter ego.
So, in terms of philosophical and political context, Tim O'Brien was very anti-war, and he even said that the Vietnam War was an outrageous double standard that Americans put themselves on. Um, for example, one of the double standards was the situation with prisoners of war or missing in action. Um, Asking to find each and every MIA would basically be a task that would be impossible, especially if the positions were reversed. The Vietnamese lost triple of what the Americans lost. So having a greater loss and a lot more people to look for would be troublesome. And not a lot of Americans consider that double standard when they uh, consider the war. Um, the MIA is something that's an issue that's still going on between Vietnam and America. There's still controversy up until this day. Tim O'Brien also considered Americans to be arrogant, ignorant, and self-righteous for being able to turn a blind eye and basically pay no attention and ignore this issue, saying that they breathe life into this. Um, I consider this take of his to be very ironic as he went to war himself and he fought against Vietnam. A quote that he brought up was, "In a war without aim, you tend not to aim. You close your eyes, you close your heart. The consequences become hit or miss in the most literal sense." So he basically means that you lose your morals. And in war, that's what happens when you have to fight for your country. You have to do a lot of killings. You have to commit a lot of crimes, and that's not good. Him saying this could be interpreted as war being a thing where people lose their morality, like I said before, their compassion and empathy for others, and just focus on getting most kills for the country. Tim O'Brien never really considered himself to be a spokesperson for war. He was never an advocate for really being anti-war. However, he did have some comments in the Vietnam War, such as saying how the ignorance of the world got many people, including himself, enlisted in the war, which meant that a lot of what people were given to by the media led a lot of people to fight a war that they didn't really believe in. A town that congratulates itself day after day on its own ignorance of the world, a town that got us into Vietnam. The people in the town sent me to that war, couldn't spell the word Hanoi, which was a word in the Vietnam language. O'Brien was talking about people who were ignorant and racist enough that they didn't even understand what other people said or how they lived their lives like normal people. They only cared about winning the war and not knowing the consequences. In terms of philosophical context, O'Brien's stories ran between the line of reality and make-believe. What I say by this is he included some parts of his life, and he also sort of included some make-believe, like some things that didn't actually happen. He had details of things encountered in his own personal life, while also blending in fiction into it as well. For example, in The Things They Carried, he carries this notion out by discussing the distinction of the truth of fiction and the truth of fact or occurrence. A quote that he says is, "The truth of fiction is sometimes more true than the truth of fact or occurrence," meaning that sometimes something that's fabricated could mean a lot more than what's being said in the moment. Feelings evoked from reading a fictional story could be much stronger, and the reader could feel a lot more emotion reading a story with less facts and more truth to it. Basically with a lot less concrete details.
So, more about Tim O'Brien. He is an American novelist who has countless works based on his war experience. His ambitions as a writer were fueled by his experiences, and he went on to write many books based on war and his fellow soldiers. Most, like Yada said earlier, he was opposed to war, he didn't agree with it. So, most of his works often focus on his personal guilt stemming from the Vietnam War. More of him is that he's known for memoirs, war stories, and short stories. And his main style of writing is realism or verisimilitude, which is between two realms known as fact and fiction. He uses this concept of verisimilitude in his works, which blurs between fact and fiction, and his approach attributed to like a rich quality to his writing style. So these are just a few of his books and works. And the first one that we're going to read in class is The Things They Carried, which was published back in March 28, 1990. It is one of his best known works, and it is a semi-autobiographical stories inspired by his experience in the Vietnam War. And in one of the chapters of The Things They Carried, O'Brien discussed and drew out two kinds of truth, which is the story truth and the happening truth. And according to him, the fictional truth is more realistic than the factual one because of the fact that fictional truth appeals to more emotions and feelings, which makes the literature more meaningful. Another one of his notable works would be If I Die in a Combat Zone, Box Me Up and Ship Me Home, which was originally published in 1973. And this is his first ever book as a writer, and it has been praised for the honest portrayal of a soldier's emotion. This was an autobiographical account of Tim O'Brien's tour of duty in the Vietnam War. The next one I am going to be discussing about is Going After Casiado, which is published in January 1978. It was hailed as the best novels dealing with conflict, and it earned the 1979 National Book Award for his works. And the last one of his works that I will be talking about is In the Lake of the Woods, which was published in 1994. It received the James Fenimore Cooper Prize from the Society of American Historians and was named the best novel of the year by Time magazine. And like I said before, these are just a few of his works. There are many more in this picture. And again, these works are based off of his portrayal and recollections of his tour of duty in Vietnam War.
The analyze of Things They Carried, Tim O'Brien, the novel, is a reflection of the destructive repercussions of Vietnam War, as well as the emotional and physical combat. It's really hard. I find it really hard to summarize Things They Carried because each chapter stands alone as a standalone narrative. The members of the Alpha Company, not only did they march, battle, camp, and have fun, dream, they also perished. In order to give the readers an understanding to make of these soldiers' ticks and how the time in the Vietnam influenced them afterwards, the book accounts for what the man, in particular Tim O'Brien describes, did before and after the war. The story recounts the events leading up to, during, following the war, and the effects Tim O'Brien and the soldiers and what was affected towards him and his battalion. The core ideas of the books is the memory, imagination, and the possibility of mental escape are present by him and the things they carry. Not only did they carry all the emotional and physical parts, but weapons, equipment, pictures, and letters, the hope, the terror, and of the memories, and guilt. These here are some of the main characters: Tim O'Brien, Jim Cross, Mitchell Sanders, and Kiowa. There's a brief description. Tim O'Brien not only is the protagonist, the narrative protagonist, and the author, he uses the storytelling to cope with the memories and the realities of war. Jim Cross is a symbol that he carries the guilt for the platoon so that they have, so they don't have to. And not only does he have the initials, but the last name is, his last name is Cross, and he often carries the burden for all of them. Moving on to Mitchell Sanders. Mitchell Sanders is from Ohio. He has a sense of humor and enjoys storytelling. He carries with him his art, storytelling, and believes that the stories do not need morals. He helps the author make a point that the novel is not to teach moral, but to portray an experience. Moving on to Kiowa, he was Native American, he was a Baptist, and his death is a symbolic of a senseless tragedy of the war and the experiences they each and the platoon experienced. So moving on to pretty much the themes, the guilt of things they carried. The men feel guilty about their errors, the victims they killed, and the chances they passed, and the possibilities they wasted. There is a letter that Broker wrote to O'Brien in this story, and basically complaining. When then he comes to realize, the letter states that there's no point of being upset with everything that he experienced because he survived, he returned home, and he is now safe and secure, which many others didn't. Many of the soldiers suddenly want to be back at war because they find it hard to be thrown in back into civilization. And with all the PTSD and everything that they endured from all the events and the memories, there was many of them that one, took their life. The others were having a hard time to civilize themselves back into their families. There was many of them that, because of the events, because of the people that they killed, because of everything that they were, that they had to do, their task and their position, and in the war, they had a hard time having to adapt and adjust, and thinking that it was a lot easier to be in the war, at war, than it is. Through the writing, Tim O'Brien was able to convey all his regrets and actions and decisions and things he had witnessed. Acceptance is another thing that the soldiers had to do. They had to overcome. The soldiers eventually came to terms with the fact of the predicaments, including the tasks they must complete, the deaths of Kiowa and all the other platoon members, their position within the squad, and the conflicts, and the fact that beauty can exist alongside the ugliness in battle. When the soldiers came home, Ted takes tranquilizers till he is shot. And then Broker hangs himself because he is unwilling to accept the new life of civilization. And then each man adjusts and accept the new circumstances in a very unique way. The aim of O'Brien's story is to help readers accept their war, a collection of collective stories. Truth also include happening, truth and exist in their minds and as a single cohesive universe. So in the story, there's several themes. The genre is the feel of utter and absolute reality. There was truth versus reality, imagination and comedy, the morality, and beliefs. With the truth versus reality, story truth and the happening truth. O Brien stated, I can say that the book forms is intimately connected to how I, as a human being, tend to view the world unfolding itself around me. It's sometimes difficult to separate the external reality from the internal processing of reality. So moving on to the imagination and comedy, O Brien highlights and emphasizes the imagination and pretending. There's also a quote here that states, he says that this theme is an important part of my work. I'm a believer in power of the imagination in ordinary human lives, and it's much more important that we often credit. The morality, Brien describes the moral conflict that persistence throughout the Vietnam War in the story. As demonstrated through the soldiers' experience with pleasure, the soldiers' moral code must change from that of the civilians' lives in order for them to find moral justification in everyday violence war requires. And then with the belief, which is the last theme that I mentioned here in the summarizing of the things to carry, being surrounded with trustworthy individuals, believing in those around you, stem from the era being populated by people who oppose the use of force in conflict. Due to this, the individuals drawn into the shared hatred bond together in order to survive. In conclusion, O Brien narrates the Vietnam War in a great detail in his book, Things They Carried, and explained why it is crucial to comprehend the overarching theme of war. One of the most destructive wars the United States has ever waged was the Vietnam War. This conflict claimed the lives of many, and those who survived often experienced PTSD. O Brien examines the hardship of the conflicts and things to carry by writing from viewpoints of various troops. At the very end of this is a quote that I really respected and felt like I should share in this last slide as in my conclusion. It explains that a true story is never moral. It does not instruct nor encourage virtue, nor suggest models of proper human behavior, nor restrain men from doing the things men have always done. If a story seems moral, do not believe it. If at the end of a war story, you feel uplifted or feel that some small bit of rectitude has been salvaged from the larger waste, then you have been made the victim of a very old and terrible lie. There is no rectitude whatsoever. There is no virtue. As the first rule of thumb, therefore, you can tell a true war story by the absolute and uncompressing allegiance to obscenity of evil. And that was O Brien, page 65.